Okay, hello and welcome everybody. We are kicking off the first of our series of discussions that we're doing around migration. We're calling it the points of no return. And in these four discussions, we're going to focus on four different things. But today we're going to talk about relief and rehabilitation the next 100 days. The idea being that the migration crisis is still underway. A lot of migrants have reached their destinations, a few are still on their way, and undoubtedly all of them, whether they have reached their destinations or are still struggling to find their way, have suffered and are continuing to suffer. We are also likely to see another wave of migration when the lockdown 4.0 or the subsequent lockdowns lift. And that's going to create a fresh set of problems for which we are mostly not prepared. The idea of this discussion is to talk about three or four things. One is to understand from ground what has been seen and what has been happening beyond what we have already been reading. The second part of it is to say what could be the solutions that we can start working on to really make sure that those who have been exposed to this terrible situation do not suffer more, not just because of the environment and conditions. Remember, this is the middle of summer now, but also the apathy of the administration, which typically they are a bigger victim of than the environment that they are in. And finally, how do we estimate the size of this problem and our response to it, which is the more prescriptive part? And the idea of these series of discussions is to arrive at some sort of prescription which is actionable from our many speakers. So today we're going to talk about the next 100 days and relief and rehabilitation. And we've got three speakers for that. And I'm going to introduce them only in a few lines because you can access their backgrounds. The first is NAUSHAD Forbes, who is also chairman of Ananta Aspen Center and from the Forbes group. Second is MANOJ KUMAR, founder of the Naandi Foundation. And finally, PARTH, a journalist who writes for the Los Angeles Times and Washington Post and also many Indian publications, including First Post. So thank you all for joining me. All of you are going to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes, and that's the idea. And I'm also obviously looking forward to questions and comments from those who are signing in or joining in. And hopefully we'll have a discussion going in about 20 minutes time. So thank you all once again for joining the first of the series of discussions titled Points of No Return under the auspices of the Ananta Aspen Center. And on that note, let me hand over now to Dr. NAUSHAD Forbes for his opening comments.
Thank you, Govind. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A pleasure to talk to you about a subject that I know I must say very little about. But I, like many others, have been a very dismayed observer of things unfolding over on our TV screens over these last 10 weeks or so. So to get straight to the question and to the topic of what we need to do in the next 100 days. Let me start with three principles. And these three principles are important because they really guide what I feel we should do. The three principles are, first, that we're one country. And as one country, any Indian has the right to live and work in any state at their choice. They do not need permission from either the union government or any state government, whether a state government to come or a state government to be received. So that's the first principle. Second, that the freedom to move is an absolute, and it's an absolute that applies in both directions. They cannot be kept back, as we saw happening, for example, in Karnataka, and they cannot be not received if they choose to return to a state. So free entry has to go together with free exit. And third, we need to give people a reasonable choice. The choice must not be between starvation and get home in some way or the other. The choice has to be a reasonable choice between survival and being able to survive, maybe not live luxuriously, but to survive while one makes one's particular choice of whether to stay or return. So with those three principles in mind, what do we do in the next 100 days? And that depends on where we start. So for people who are stranded, still stranded, wanting to return, we need to ensure two things. First, that we try to accommodate their return as comfortably as possible through buses or trains. And really, I think the change that we need today is to somehow depoliticize the transport of people back to the states that they've come from. It's become very much of a political football where union government blames the state government if the state government happens to be an opposition government. The state opposition government blames the union government if it happens to be an opposition government, and so on. And somehow we need to figure out how we can depoliticize the issue and deal with it on the ground. The other is that while people are waiting to return, they need to be provided with accommodation and food. The great bulk of people have come for construction and construction work. They tend to live at building sites in the best of times. So they need to be able to continue living at those building sites in the best of times, or if we can make better arrangements, wonderful, but at least they should be able to live where they used to live, and we need to be able to provide them with food. The better local areas have been doing just this. They've got companies to sponsor food for people, and it doesn't, I have to say, it doesn't take that much. We're not a huge company, but we were able to provide without a problem food for 2 months for 20,000 people. And it doesn't take that much. I think that came to some 30 lakhs or something. It's not a huge amount. It can be done on a large, widespread scale across urban areas. So that's the first thing that we should do for people who are stranded and wanting to return. Second is people who are back in their originating states and are now starting to worry about livelihoods. I think we need to connect with them. Past employers need to connect with them so that they have clarity on what prospects exist for them if they return. And if they choose to travel back, then they can travel back again in a reasonably comfortable way. Third is people who've stayed. They've stayed and probably are wondering about how long their livelihoods will continue to be supported or they can continue to survive. And I think they fall into two categories again. People who are temporary. Abhijit Banerjee estimates that 90% of migrant labor in the country is actually temporary and moves for less than 3 months at a time. And if they're on a temporary basis, the same thing that we talked about earlier, which is how do we provide accommodation and food largely through the construction sites, and with a responsibility being placed on the employer. And here it would be particularly the construction companies that are employers. And then for people who are permanent, and this is the last comment, I think, and I hope we can get into some of this in more detail as we go along. I think we need a new social, we need to use the current situation as a new beginning, the current situation as prompting a new beginning in two areas. First, to address people who are permanently living in urban areas and have permanently migrated to urban areas, who tend to live in slums. And how do we address slums in a fundamental way? I had this pet theory that one should address them through these big slum development programs and so on. Abhijit Banerjee, I asked him that question and he says that's wrong. He says the right way to address it is much more fundamentally by addressing FSI regulations in cities in a dramatic way and addressing therefore the entire housing market in cities, fix the issue permanently in the long run. Maybe we can get into that as a possible topic later on. And the second social contract is in getting the balance right for informal labor employment between flexibility and protection. We today have this situation where permanent labor is almost totally protected and almost completely inflexible. And that's a small 10, 15% of the workforce. And then we have 85, 90% of the workforce where you have almost complete flexibility and almost no protection. And we need to get the balance right somewhere in between. It's a big problem for us to address, but if we don't address it when we're facing the current crisis, when it's at the top of all of our minds across the country, when will we?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Forbes. Parth, it's over to you. So tell us about what you've been seeing, and I know that you've been reporting on ground on migrants, and you're based in Mumbai right now, but you've been covering a lot of area around us. And what have you been seeing, and your takeaways from some of the more bigger stories that you've done?
Thank you first of all for having me. What's come across starkly in the past few days and weeks is that how we have robbed the migrant workers of their dignity. I mean, it's not like they lived a great life before the lockdown, but they at least worked hard for a living. They sent some money back home. Now they have to depend on charity for 2 meals a day, and that is humiliating. Secondly, this exodus also underlines that our cities may provide the workers with economic opportunities, but they don't provide social security. I remember meeting a young man who on a highway in Mumbai who told me, why do I have to justify my act of going home? घर जाना है यार, माँ बाप के पास जाना है, he said. And you know, he's right. I mean, you want to be surrounded by your people in times of crisis. And this, desperation to head home was exemplified by this man I met on Mumbai-Nashik highway. He had lost a leg in 2012, 8 years back, in a bike accident. And he was riding back home to Madhya Pradesh, 1200 kilometers on a gearless scooter with his wife and a 3-year-old daughter. It had a sidecar, but it was an extremely dangerous journey because that highway has seen a lot of accidents. He made it back home and called me and said, "Sirji, main pahunch gaya," and I couldn't have been more relieved. But that's just one example of how desperate people have become to get back home. And this, people have paid 3,000 rupees, 4,000 rupees, borrowed money from someone, crammed themselves on trucks, bought bicycles, and they're riding home like 1100, 1200 kilometers. Apart from, of course, walking endlessly to their homes. And that restlessness or impatience to head home, even when there are Shramik trains being organized, stems from this communication gap that I think the state governments and central government has completely failed in reassuring the migrant workers of staying where they were, because what's happening is when a migrant worker submits his or her details to a local police station, they are not given any timeline or any idea of when they would be able to board the train back home. So essentially they have to submit their details and wait for a phone call for eternity, and that's not very reassuring. So a lot of people register and then leave the moment they find an alternative mode of transport, which basically means that the police, when they come up with a list of say 1,500 or 1,600 people for the train, many of them have already left. So the police fill up these seats by getting in people at the last minute who have not registered, and that leads to even more chaos because there are thousands waiting to fill up a few hundred seats. I mean, I was at Vasai the other day. There's this huge land, it's about 70 acres of land where the municipal corporation over there asks people to gather, asks migrant workers to gather before they take them to the station. Now, there are so many people who who sort of gather there in the hope of getting onto the train. They have not registered, but they know that a lot of the people who have registered have already left, so they hope to get on that train in the last minute. And that, it's so heartbreaking to see them, meet them, because they've given up their rented homes, they've packed their bags, they've come to that ground hoping to get back, and then they spend their day watching others get on the train or get on the bus, and with a lot of envy. And when at the end of the day they don't get on the train, the police ask them to vacate the ground, except they have nowhere else to go because they have given up their land. Give up their rented house. So, long story short, this entire crisis is a manifestation of collective apathy that we have shown towards the migrant workers over the past several years. Actually, the fact is that they've been exploited for a long time before the lockdown. They lived in appalling conditions for a long time before the lockdown. They worked too hard for too little money for a long time before the lockdown. But the media, the civil society, and the government woke up to the existence of migrant workers on 25th March. And I think that is the most telling and shameful aspect of the entire crisis.
Okay, thanks, Parth. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and we'll come back. And it's over to Manoj.
Thanks, Govind. So I'll start with a disclaimer that, I represent the Naandi Foundation, which is an NGO, and we work in close to 19 states in India. And this covers looking after the education needs of almost 180,000 girls. Also, we give training and jobs every year to close to 100,000 youth, unemployed youth all over the country. And then we work large parts with farmers. We have not been doing direct relief of supplies at this moment because we are more a rehabilitation long-term NGO, but we have been constantly monitoring and trying to do case-to-case help in the communities that we have been working with. So I'm trying to report from what my 5,000 strong team in the field have been feeding into me and to all of us in terms of what these communities are going through currently. And some of the ideas that we harvested in terms of their voices from the field on what they think could be opportunities for government and all of us in the next 100 days. So that's the broad disclaimer. So one is many of them. So we work in Dharavi, for example. We have around 1,000 families ready to migrate the moment lockdown is lifted. This will be within Maharashtra itself, they will go. We work in Shravasti, Nepal border of Uttar Pradesh, extremely impoverished region, frankly speaking. Girls are not even in classrooms in government schools from secondary standard if you go there. One of the pockets where child trafficking is not even reported seriously. 50% of, almost 6,000 families that we know directly, the men have come back from North India, especially Delhi, back some way or the other to Shravasti. And they are there. So to all these people, we ask, why are you running away? What's the main reason? Is it that people in cities have treated you so badly? Is it that you want to be with your family? One of the things that has come out, and I don't see it outside now, is that there is so much stigma created. There is so much fear created. Everybody is scared. These are street smart people. There have been people who didn't care about life and death. But suddenly when I meet them, I talk to them, they are scared. There is a panic. I mean, well-to-do people, we get scared very soon. I'm sorry to say this, at least I do. So it's not a big deal. But these are people who play with life every day, but they are panicking. They're scared. We have first responsibility in these 100 days to go back to them and tell them that don't panic. The whole nation is with you. This is a virus. And we will deal with you. This is one. Along with that is stigma. If people are running away because they're scared, they'll be found positive. I have had people asking me, are there tricks to beat the temperature? When the thermometer is shown, is there a way to beat it? Can we keep baraf? Ice lakne se kam hoga kya 2 degree? I mean, what are we talking? Because they're saying the moment it is there, we will be put somewhere else. Instances of death, you have no idea who is taking to. Unlike many of us, for the poor, death is a serious ritual. It's like the Greek tragedies. If people die, that's the only time they actually come together and do something, whether it's my tribal area in Araku or in poor communities. Here, the moment somebody is dead or even diagnosed COVID, you're taken like the municipal garbage and taken around hospital shopping and then dumped. And after death, you are told somebody has died. I mean, this is reality. I have 2 deaths of COVID in my family. They are well-to-do people with huge connections. I'm sorry to say this is what they went through. The family was finally told, you will not be given a COVID positive certificate as a reason for death. These are serious issues. We are creating a fear and superlative fear out of this pandemic, and that has to be addressed. Second, I'm looking at the families. They all are immensely grateful to this country and the people for giving food and for showering love when they are on walking and doing various things. But they want cash. Everyone is telling me, can I have some cash in hand? Why can't we do a cash transfer? I was doing back of envelope calculation with my policy team in Naandi. The best figures tell me that on a conservative level, we may be having something like, 4 crore migrant workers. We need probably a kind of a register or a census to recognize who are migrant workers, just as we did Aadhaar. This is at least one time to do it. And we should do just cash transfer. On a conservative estimate, even if I were to calculate 250 rupees cash transfer for 100 days, it's going to be 5% of the 20 lakh crore that was promised by the government. So I'm saying, can we do a cash transfer of 1 lakh crore? And I mean, I know somebody has to ask these numbers. And can we give it just to their bank accounts for those who claim to be migrant laborers, come and report? I know this is provocative. I know that this may not be very scientific, but are we doing everything else scientific? And my last point, most of the families who've gone back are telling me we left, first of all, to cities from rural India because agriculture reforms haven't happened and we didn't have a livelihood. So after a few months, they're going to come back to cities. Current mood is they're saying they won't come. But I'm sure the reality will kick in. We have time to make labor laws here. The labor laws for migrant laborers are pathetic. And I have my friends writing about this. We need to look at how can we guarantee health insurance? How can we guarantee they're going back to their homes properly? How can we ensure that their living conditions are better? There is a huge opportunity for us to address, and this 100 days we should address. I'll stop here for the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Manoj, and thank you all for the questions that are coming, and keep them coming. So let's start off. I mean, I thought I'll throw in a few questions first and then, but I think there are some good ones which I should pick immediately. So Swaminathan S asks to Dr. Forbes, to what extent do you think the problem is a creation of Indian industry who have shied away from their responsibility? And I believe that can be traced to the way Indian industry has historically treated labor.
So I think it has something to do with the labor contracts that I mentioned earlier on, which is that you have permanent labor that is completely protected and where there is almost no flexibility, and then informal labor, whether it's people working, at large construction sites, or whether it's people working ones and twos in restaurants or whatever, where there is complete flexibility and no protection. I think we do need to address that in a fundamental way and find the right balance between protection and flexibility across the labor force. Because if we do, we will both make labor more flexible and we will make it more protected. And we will end up protecting the people who need protection, and we will end up creating flexibility where we need to create flexibility. So I think we need to start addressing that quite fundamentally.
So
Has Indian industry prompted this? Indian industry, like Indians, comes in all shapes, sizes, and forms. And you have companies that I think have behaved very badly, where they have simply left people without livelihoods and to fend for themselves. And you have companies that have dealt very humanely and positively with people and assured them, not only provided them with their ongoing payments and salaries, including, by the way, people who are on contract, right? But have also said to them that, look, for the foreseeable future, they will continue to be supported and protected. And where companies have done that, people have chosen not to go. Or where they've chosen to go with a very clear message. You tell us when we can come back, we're keen to come back. And in fact, I can say in my own organization, we have people who moved back to other parts of the state because they simply couldn't work on the production floor. So what's the point of hanging around here, right? When the factory was closed. They're all keen to come back now that it's restarted. We're sending buses to pick them up and come back. They're all keen to come back. They're coming back as soon as they possibly can find ways of getting back. It's not a difficult thing to do. So I think you have the full range of experiences and how companies have dealt with it. But I do think we need to fundamentally address the flexibility protection trade-off in our labor contracts.
And anything that you are doing specifically, I know you've talked about a bunch of things, but anything that you're planning to do in the next 4 to 6 weeks that addresses this question?
In terms of fundamental labor contracts across the country?
So that is the broader picture.
That's a big issue.
In terms of either getting people back or giving them.
Yeah. So that for sure. So we've been able to get back probably about between 2/3 and 3/4 of the people who'd gone back to their villages. There are a few who are still in villages, in towns which are containment areas and where there are some issues with them being able to move out from there right now. As soon as those ease, we should be able to get the rest back. But I think one of the things that we did was that from the first week, we ensured we stayed in touch with people and across the board, including, for example, we paid all our contractors. You don't pay contract members directly. So for example, people who work for our canteen contractor, right? Now, when the factory was closed, there was obviously no food being served, so there was no need for a canteen contract. But we said to the canteen contractor that we would keep paying the canteen contractor the total amount of his wage bill on the basis that he continued to pay all his people their wages, right? And then we would, we're a relatively medium-sized company, so we know people and we can speak to people and say, listen, are you being paid? Yeah, and we made sure they were being paid. It's
right.
not,
So I think
it's not impossible. It's not impossible.
So I mean, I was talking to Niranjan Hiranandani on a slightly different platform, but I was interviewing him and I was asking him the same question. So I mean, I think builders often say that the construction industry says that the intermediation is so high because you give to contractors, they give to another set of contractors, and the last rung of contractors typically would be the most callous about this and stop payment, and which is what happened exactly on most construction sites across the country. So how do we address that? I mean, you said that as a small company, you could do this. Now, the construction industry in itself is a big culprit here, willingly or unwillingly. So how do we ensure that money gets paid to the contractor who can be enforced upon to make sure that the people who receive that money or should receive that money actually get it?
I think it's tougher to do for large construction projects where, for example, you have 10,000 people or 20,000 people at a particular site. Without question, it's much tougher to do there. And these are 10 or 20,000 people who've come to work just for a 3-month period. So, there's actually usually a fairly poor record also of who's come and who's there and so on. So I think it is tougher to do.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's easier to provide some of that support in kind, where you actually say, look, all the people are living there in any case, let them continue to live there and just provide the support in kind, provide the support in the form of food until such time as we can figure out what Manoj was saying of some kind of a direct benefit transfer where you can transfer cash to people. But until such time as one figures that out, make sure that people aren't going hungry and they have a place to sleep.
Right. So I was interviewing Mahesh Vyas, the economist and of CMI, and his calculation was that, of course, 120 million people have lost their jobs.
Yeah.
And his calculation was that we should be paying about 20,000 rupees, no questions asked, into bank accounts. That is 10,000 rupees per month. And that would, to pick up on Manoj's point about, transferring money.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that those numbers, or some of them have been worked out. Parth, let me come to you. There's a question from Suman Berry. And he asked, we've been told that slums were vote banks, which is why they survived. Why did the Dons not protect their wards?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part.
So the question is, he says that we've been told that slums were vote banks, which is why they survived all this while. Why did the Dons not protect their wards? What's your sense? I mean, did they feel, I mean, were people, the people you spoke to, did they feel that they were not getting the protection that they earlier enjoyed, or this was such a free for all and every person for herself or himself that it didn't matter?
No, I mean, obviously people are disappointed in slums. And I think when I traveled in Mumbai slums, especially when I, say for example, I went to Dharavi or Kurla or a few other slums around Goregaon, what I found was that the upper middle class and the higher middle class who appointed them as domestic workers, they have sent them on unpaid leaves. And I think that's something that hurt them a lot, because there are people who've worked for them, cleaned their dishes, done their house for 18 years, 22 years, and they have told them कि यार नहीं होगा, 2 महीने आप जब वापस आएंगे तब आपको पगार देंगे. And that's something that's hurt them. And I think it's shameful. I mean, these are the people who come to their balconies and bang plates for doctors, or pretend to bang plates for, pretend to care about doctors. I mean, this is the least you can do. I mean, you can just look after your own people who've been dependent on you for so many years. I mean, you can pay their salaries. It's not that hard for someone living in a 3 BHK apartment in Mumbai to pay 3,000 rupees to your domestic worker, and that has also had a sort of an impact on the NGOs that are trying to reach out to people in distress. Because what's happened is now the NGOs are trying to reach out to migrant workers, domestic helps, and the homeless. If the upper middle class had just taken care of their own domestic workers, the NGOs could have just focused on the migrant workers and the homeless. Now they've spread too thin. So I think this is also something that I noticed in slums, that higher middle class employers have sent them on unpaid leaves, and that's kind of disheartening.
Right. Okay. Manoj, you talked about the fear, and there are a couple of questions which focus on the fear part. How do we address the fear of the pandemic rather than the migration and the jobs part, which Parth also alluded to. So, and there's another question from Swaminathan S again. He says, do you see the large number of migrants making the choice to stay back and not look for opportunities outside their home states? What percentage do you think will make this choice? But I think let's address the fear. And how do we, if we can, so boldly in the next 100 days, even try and respond to this?
So I think there are two factors to look at when we speak about fear. One is fear based on information that goes around. Currently there is so much of misinformation about this, from having ginger hot drinks to mask or unmask, to whether to touch or not touch. Can I take the newspaper or not? I mean, everything is out in the open. Responsible global leaders, I mean, as somebody joked, epidemiologists have become economists and economists have become epidemiologists. So given this kind of confusion about who is controlling this news, we need some sense of addressing some broad guidelines, which we say, for instance, this is a virus and virus is here to stay till the vaccines come, for instance. So some way of demystifying it in a more organized manner could help. I mean, this is where state missionary should take the responsibility and probably reach it out to everyone, especially the poorer sections and how they are dealt with. I find it very appalling to take on Parth's point additionally and say, I have people who believe that this virus is going to first catch the maids and not anyone else, and say that, keep them away. And that, I always try to argue that maybe we are going to give the domestic help, the virus, and not the other way around for a change. So it's not entirely a hygiene related issue. I mean, not to mention that big towers have hygiene, but the point is it has to be looked at. Second aspect about the fear aspect, which I feel is, it is the first time, at least in my memory, a disease is dealt by police. Everywhere it is the police. What I meant to say is, when I go to the road, it's the police controlling. The circulars are coming from Home Ministry. When I speak to people in the slums, the thing that they fear most is police coming to their house. So the kind of fear automatically envelops when we have got a war-like situation. We have like a law and order-like situation, because everywhere it's police. I salute. I have so many friends. The two professions I have maximum friends actually are media and police. So I salute the police. I mean, they are day and night working. I want to use this forum to acknowledge this. They're 24/7 there. I have some cops who tell me that the moment the lockdown is over, they'll disappear because they're like going mad. But people are scared that a disease is controlled by cops. So
and there is good reason for that. And there is good reason. I mean, they are getting, there are enough videos going around of police beating up people, picking up handcarts of their vegetables and throwing them around. And these things go viral. Okay. So we need to address that also. Yeah. Okay. So let me pick up a couple more points. Swaminathan's come back and says the last rung is not the problem. The first level, if the first level is empathy, everybody down the line will show empathy and do what is right. This is the reference to Niranjan Hiranandani and the construction thing. Let me clarify. Niranjan Hiranandani I did interview him on this. He did talk about what went wrong with migrants, but he did not specifically blame the contractors. There was another individual I interviewed from the construction industry out of Bangalore when we saw that crisis of migrants wanting to get out and trains being cancelled, and he said that. So that's the clarification. So here's a question which in a way can point to a solution. So Rishit Shroff asks, last mile payments to migrant workers are not happening as contractors fear that these remaining workers will run off to their native place if they release their payments, and subsequently their business, for example, of providing security services will not happen. So how do we address this, which seems to be also an immediate problem and a solution? So Manoj, you want to go first, and then Dr. Forbes.
Yeah. So as far as I'm concerned, I want to reiterate the fact that the responsibility cannot be passed on. I mean, that has to be something at everyone's level. I mean, we had this famous international MNC brands, whether it was the Nike or the garment shoe industry in Bangladesh. We all jumped and said the responsibility should be with the brand. So I think whether at each one of us, we have to be very clear. One thing this pandemic has told us again and again, at least in crisis like this, you cannot pass on responsibility. Now, and we need to own it, and we need to take that extra effort to go till the last and see how it is done. If NAUSHAD is able to do it because he has a medium-sized company, that's good for him. But that cannot be an excuse for a large company to say, I can't track it. You know, sure. We need to be very clear that this cannot be passed on. And we cannot leave it just to say that state regulators will come and find. And when they do, we'll say they're harassing. State is now become inspector. State is doing license raj. We ask us to do responsibility ourselves, we don't do. I mean, in our own society, in the buildings, I tried to went personally like a madman and told everyone that we need to ensure that if the domestic help is not coming, please pay. I mean, and it was said in good faith. I'm telling all my employees that possible that whatever kind of extended staff and labor we are, just let's keeping. We run this project, Nanikali, which has nearly 4,000 temporary teachers. We ensured that although the schools are shut down, they're all paid. So there has to be a awakening.
Right. Okay. So, Dr. Forbes, is sort of the same question plus an operational layer to it. So, how does a company, even if it's a mid-sized company, ensure this? I mean, and how are you doing it, for instance? Is it the human resources department which drives it? You know, how do you talk to the chain? How do you ensure the contractor is taking care of their people? And more so, how could medium-sized companies, or for that matter, large companies who've not woken up so far, do this in the next 100 days?
So, I mean, I think the answer is that it is up to the company. I think, as Manoj said, it's exactly that the responsibility is with the principal employer, right? And it's the responsibility of the principal employer to ensure that people are being paid right down the chain. Large companies have more people. They have large departments who can do just this. They're all working from home. This is work that can be done very effectively from home, actually. And it can be done by, in our case, our HR team played the key role in it, but we encouraged people, our HR team encouraged people saying that, listen, you know, you're in touch with the person who brings you your tea every day. Give him a call, find out how he's doing. Does he need anything? Is he being paid by his contractor, right? And you know, you can form those kinds of chains and links, and it's not impossible to do. I mean, can I say that every last person has without question been paid? I wish I could, but I can't confirm that. But have we really tried hard? And can I say broadly that everyone has been paid? Yes, I can.
Okay. There's a couple of questions which are to do with the logistics, and you know, so let me start with the first one. It says, is it not the time, Sham Sharma asks, is it not the time to think of dormitories, small accommodation in place of slums to make these places hygienic and healthy? After all, coronavirus is not the first or the last virus. Dr. Forbes, do you want to start off on that?
Yeah, you know, if he'd asked this question a week ago, I'd have said yes. Well, actually, 5 days ago, I'd have said yes. But then there are two contrary things that have been pointed out to me. One by my nephew, who reminded me that the spread of the virus in Singapore has precisely been in these dormitories that have been set up for largely construction workers and sort of migrant labor who've come in the dormitories, and the intensity of those dormitories has been the place that the infection has spread. It's the nature of the virus that it spreads in these small, confined, highly populated spaces. Yeah. So that's the first thing. So I don't think dormitories, I think, can be an improvement in the quality of life, and that's why we should do them. But it won't help us with the current crisis in terms of preventing the spread of the virus. I mean, I think we should be clear about that. Sure. I think the second thing that changed my mind was actually as I mentioned, when I asked Abhijit Banerjee this question, and his response was, well, these slum redevelopment programs have tended not to work that effectively. One needs a broader term solution to address fundamentally land use regulations in cities. You know, our FSI regulations in our cities are amongst the lowest in the world. And if we were to dramatically change our FSI regulations, maybe we do it at a stroke, or we do it in steps, I don't know. But if we were to dramatically change our FSI regulations and bring them into line with what international practice is, you would free up huge potential to develop cities in the country. And if you provide huge potential to develop cities, you will then enable much lower cost housing and the whole range of housing being provided. Today you have in Bombay, what's the problem? The problem is that you have, in particular parts of the city, in South Bombay, you have slums, and you have apartments that cost over ₹1 crore minimum for a small apartment. Yeah. And there's nothing in between. Yeah. So you need the whole range. You need something that is available for 20 lakhs and something available for 50 lakhs and something available for ₹1 crore and then up. And you can only do that by addressing actually development regulations for cities in a widespread way. Right. It won't solve the problem overnight, but maybe in 5 years or 10 years, we can have much better quality, livable, healthier cities.
Right. And yes, if everyone had homes that they could call their homes and their own homes, Correct. They would obviously not be wanting to migrate or reverse migrate, as we saw. Yeah. Okay, so Sudhi Sharma asked, and let me come to Parth for this. The question actually, and I'm going to add a layer to it, can it or will it be helpful for migrants if we provide them a permanent job card like Narega and enlist them in a formal system? And it should be universally accepted across the state and all sectors wherever they wish to work. So of course, Narega is a government role, and what the people we are talking about are employed by the private sector. So there is a gap there. But I think the point is valid and has been raised in the last few weeks, that should there be a migration council of sorts which looks at the problems of migrants by state. And every state has sort of ownership on this. And that, of course, leads to another set of questions which we'll come to. So Parth, but when you talk to people and when you've been talking to migrants, what is their key, I mean, do they want the government to help at all? And to what extent? Or do they want, or is their primary frustration and or despair really driven by the fact that they were driven out of their jobs because, or the homes that they were staying in because they could not pay rent or could not earn income to pay the rent?
Right. So it's a bit of a mix of both. There is clear-cut, despondency among the migrant workers that there was absolutely no thought that went behind lockdown when it came to their condition and their hardships. You don't shut a country of 1.3 billion with 4 hours notice. I think that's something that a lot of migrant workers said. I mean, they said कि अगर पहले ही अगर 2-3 दिन का नोटिस दे दिया होता तो हम चले जाते अपने घर, और वहाँ एटलीस्ट गांव में घर है, नमक रोटी खा सकते हैं, you have your farmlands, you have your people basically around you. Now here they basically they live hand to mouth, and it becomes very difficult for them to even pay rent, organize for food, electricity bills. So it's there was absolutely no consideration of the migrant workers that went behind any of these policies. Secondly, I think we converted some of our 5-star facilities into quarantine facilities for those who came from abroad. At the same time, we could have just converted our schools, colleges, and our marriage halls or community centers as shelter homes for the migrant workers. I mean, we could have moved them there, those who had been kicked out of their homes, rented homes by the landlord, and it would have also been easier to reach out to them with relief, because now what's happening is they are under one bridge tomorrow, second bridge the next day, on the third highway the day after that, and it's become very difficult to even reach out to them consistently. And lastly, I think when we talk about migration, we have to put it in context of rural distress, because the sheer scale of migration should basically make us pause and wonder why so many people decided to leave their families, farmlands and friends behind and work in Mumbai or Delhi for 300 rupees a day, decided to live under a bridge somewhere in appalling conditions. I mean, why did they, what compelled them to make that decision? And I think that's something that we need to fundamentally address. Right now, they may say, as Mr. Manoj said, that they may say right now we won't come back for a while, but after 4 or 5 months, the reality will kick in, and they'll realize that they left their homes because they didn't have any work in the first place.
Right.
So they would have to come back to cities to make their ends meet. And that, I think, is a very, it's the most disturbing or depressing part of the social contract that we have right now. Right now, the rural residents are at the mercy of their urban employers. And I think we need to even that equation a bit. What's happening is between 1995 and 2015, more than 3 lakh farmers in India have committed suicide at the rate of 40 per day. Between 1991 and 2011, nearly 15 million farmers have stopped being main cultivators and become agricultural laborers. So what's happening is that the farmers who used to employ agricultural laborers are going down. And the number of agricultural laborers who depended on farmers to be employed are exploding. And that mismatch is basically leading to this mass migration towards urban from rural. And I think that is something that we need to address fundamentally if we want to make the condition of migrant workers better in any sense.
Right. Okay. So this is a good segue to two questions that have come from James Abraham and Reshma Anand. So James asked, our businesses are in rural areas, and as migrants are coming back, we're seeing a rapid increase in the number of COVID-19 positive cases. That's inevitable. And he also says it's quickly outstripping the capacity of the police and the healthcare system. What can we do to help as we are local there? Reshma Anand says industry accounts for about 10% of organized labor. The balance is, as we all know, unorganized. Bulk of our migrants work in such unorganized and unregulated industries, including our homes. What's the panel's view on universalizing food, work, and healthcare for the poor in India? So we're sitting in urban centers and looking at the problem. If we were to switch around, how would we look at it? Dr. Forbes, do you want to go first?
So, if you ask me, how can we address this in rural areas that are near urban centers? I think that's the next issue that we can take up. Our main plant is in a place called Chakan, which has become one of the big industrial centers in the country. And we've been working as a company with various nearby villages. These are really very tiny hamlets, and they're not far away. I mean, they are 5 kilometers to 30 kilometers, 50 kilometers away, and small groups of people, maybe as little as 10 and 20 families in some cases, ranging up to smaller villages in other cases. And I think there's a lot that we can do from our companies in these areas. And I think there's a responsibility we can take. And I think companies are doing that, and we can do it more. There are various approaches that can be very effective, in these areas. How do we do something across the country? At least we don't have the bandwidth to do that. So I think we should start with what's near us, move a little bit further afield, move still a little bit further afield, and at least make sure that within 10, 20 kilometers of where we are located, we address these issues as much as we can.
Okay, Manoj, I mean, how would you view the question that James has put? If we were to flip the responsibility around, now that many migrants are where they originally came from and will obviously need much better healthcare facilities than they enjoyed traditionally.
No, so I'll go back to 2 points, which are my pet themes based on work with farmers and rural India extensively. One is that we need to recognize the fact that it is the huge agrarian crisis that has left the only skills that these people had, which was agriculture, and go back to a completely unskilled urban setup to look for a living. So we have a great opportunity to focus on agrarian reform. If you can do that, make those right investments, I think along with that, I mean, it's fun. It's bizarre. The entire corporate sector and the stock markets depend on a monsoon to see whether it is going up or not, because that pushes rural demand. And then we have if rural economy does well, then rest of India does well. So we need to use this opportunity to seriously look at agrarian reforms. I mean, the kind of impetus we gave to IT and software and export-oriented growth in the 90s, I think something really big has to come.
So what's the one thing that, so we are talking about a 100-day time frame, Manoj. So what's the one thing you feel from an agrarian reform viewpoint that we could focus on?
I mean, we are at Kharif season. I mean, all the farmers are wanting the freedom to get their seeds. They want to sow, they want mobility, and they need all the support that is needed now for Kharif to happen. Even with excess labor, they are not able to get all the seeds and requirements for doing the sowing and start the Kharif season. So I think we should facilitate that at the earliest. People are, even in rural areas now, a bit locked down. And I think that has to be eased up, and we need to help. Cash has to be given to at least them. They again don't have cash. So somewhere these two have to be done. I see Parth raising his hand, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Parth.
Just wanted to make one corollary point to that. What we have seen in the agrarian areas is that farmers have been unable to sell their Rabi crops, Rabi harvest, because of the lockdown. They couldn't get their crop to the mandi. Many of those couldn't even harvest their crops because of the lockdown. And that has led to huge losses. So they don't have money or capital to raise for the Kharif season. I think what we need to do immediately is extend as many crop loans as possible to the farmers, so they can at least sow some seeds and sow their crops for the Kharif season. It's not hampered.
Right. Thanks for that. But so we talked about housing. Yeah.
Can I add a comment? To come back to your second question, sometimes I think we approach this we approach the whole migration issue as in a somewhat idealistic way, and I'm that somehow people are better off living in rural areas and working as farmers. I'm not sure I buy that. I'm a big believer in cities. Yes, they might be crowded, dirty places, but they're sources of employment, efficiency, economic activity, vibrancy. They drive the country forward economically. And I think we should figure out how we make our cities better and indeed more attractive places for people to move.
Right.
70% of our population lives in rural areas. That's a failure of Indian development for decades. So I think we should not see a positive future for India as being one where 70% of our population continues to live in rural areas. We should see India becoming more like the rest of the world, which is we need hundreds of cities that have million-plus populations.
Right.
Over the decades.
Right, and which leads to the housing question or the issue once again. And Jamshid Godrej points out that the rental market for housing is almost non-existent, mainly due to the Rent Act, where owners do not wish to rent as they may not be able to reclaim their apartments. So why are we ignoring this and not addressing something that was instituted by the British during World War II? Do you want to go at it, Dr. Forbes?
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. We should. It's silly. Who does the Rent Act? Who do these rental controls protect? They protect incumbents again. They protect people who already have apartments at very low rents, right? So how do you address that? There are simple ways in which one can address that. One of the ways that you grandfather existing agreements, or you grandfather existing agreements for a particular point of time, for a certain number of years, 10 years or something like that. And then you say, okay, everything else, you have a free housing market. Right? And you can actually provide, I'm told that in Bombay, which is such a congested city, I'm told that there are over 50,000 apartments that lie vacant because people don't wish to rent them out, right? If 50,000 apartments suddenly came onto the market as available rental housing, rents in the city would crash. Wonderful, wonderful for poorer people. And I think we would then create incentives for developments that would provide for low rent, low income housing. I think there's an opportunity, there's a huge opportunity here where we can improve well-being and drive economic activity at the same time. But we need to get beyond these hang-ups and these vested interests that keep us from moving beyond rent control, that keep us from moving beyond the current FSI regulations, all of that stuff. And then I think we have to simply welcome migrants from rural areas to our cities and make it healthier for them to come.
Right. Another question for you, Dr. Forbes, from Vishwas Kurundkar. He says and asks, are there any regulations in force to ensure labor contractors register their migrant and local workers with government agencies? And does industry validate that they will only allow registered labor?
So I'm pretty certain that there are regulations that require the principal employer to ensure, for example, that provident funds are, provident fund accounts, etc., are set up, that there's a provident fund contribution that is made. And I can't imagine how you would provide a provident fund payment without some form of registration and official documentation. Beyond that, I don't know.
Okay, anyway, so this is a suggestion for going forward as other people.
But I think this thing that no one knows, who's where is an excuse.
Okay. So anyway, this has been a suggestion, like I mentioned earlier, from other fora as well, that states should be looking at, a database that they manage and they know who's in and who's out. So
the data shouldn't be owned by the government. The data should be available, and everyone should have access to it. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Sorry. So I'm going to come to the sum up question in a moment, and let me start with Manoj first. So Richard Schroff has asked, what are the top 3 actions we can take right now? So just to remind everyone, we are talking about a 100-day timetable of sorts. We are talking about the relief and rehabilitation, and we're also talking about specific prescriptions. So Manoj, do you want to go first, the top 3 actions that we can take, and then I'll come to the others.
No, I believe we need to work on the fear and stigma again. I will say this again very strongly. I will also say that there has to be a little more clearer guideline and ease of mobility. More as a fundamental right for me to go back to my home. And given the cramped conditions in the city, if some people actually want to go back to their villages, it is not walking on the streets which is the way out. We need to really move, and that's an easy proposition to do. If the trains that were converted for treatment with ventilators are lying vacant, let's get them moving and let's take the migrant laborers to their villages. So that is second. Third, I genuinely still believe some way states should take responsibility, district administration should take responsibility, and some way these migrant laborers should get some cash transfer done. There is an acute shortage of cash. I think we have more shortage of cash for the poor than demonetization time. I would stick my neck out and argue. And we need to put some cash. That's
right. Parth, instead of asking you for prescription, let me ask you about the one story or the one person you met that moved you the most in the last 30 to 60 days that you've been reporting on this.
I think it would be that man I met on the Mumbai-Nashik highway. He had lost a leg in 2012 in a bike accident, and he decided to ride on his gearless scooter back home to Madhya Pradesh, 1200 kilometers with his three-year-old daughter and wife. I was very moved when he called me, but I was obviously extremely worried for him because he had to do this 1200 kilometer journey. And he told me, he made me 2 promises. He said, "Bas raat ko 10 baje ke baad nahi chalaunga aur wapas pahunch kar aapko phone karunga." And he kept the second of the promises because he was riding the bike, he told me, until 2 in the night. And he would wake up at 5 in the morning and carry on with his journey. I mean, that highway has seen a lot of accidents. He was aware of it. He told me he was scared, but it was just the desperation and instinct.
But, and did he blame anyone? I mean, was he?
He was the one who said that यार 4 घंटे का notice देके कौन बंद करता है देश? So it has given us more time to at least figure our stuff out. I mean, this is the least that you could have done, and at least given us a choice of whether we wanted to stay in cities or whether we wanted to figure something out here or we wanted to go back. Here we were left in a sort of a limbo. Just one quick point that I wanted to make, slight disagreement with Mr. NAUSHAD. He said that, of course, we need to encourage people to come to cities and make it more vibrant. But that encouragement should come by making our cities more livable and not by destroying their livelihoods back home. That's something that's happening right now. So right now we've not left them with any choice. Their migration is out of survival and desperation, not out of choice. And I think that's the critical nuance that we need to underline.
Right. So, Dr. Forbes, last word to you and question: the top 3 actions we can take right now, and how can we create the alignment of resources and efforts to effectively do that?
So first, I agree with Parth. Cities should be attractive places for people to come, as opposed to people being pushed out of where they are now. I think let me put it this way. I think we need to decentralize. So can we approach this issue as a city by city issue instead of a state government, union government issue? And where the union government and the state government, they fall in line with what the cities wish to do. So for example, if we can approach this and say, in the city of Pune, if we have migrants who wish to go home, what's the transport that they need? Where do they want to go? What's the best way for them to do it? How do we take care of them in the interim while they're still here? Yeah, and who can help and provide food, etc. Right? And then you do the same for people who wish to stay, right? And say, how do you take care of livelihoods, etc. here? And again, how do you get people from industry, etc. involved? Can we, as local industry, have some norms of behavior, some practices that we will follow for providing a minimum of protection going forward, as well as people come back? I think we should try and approach this as a distributed solution that runs across many different cities. And then if we have some really good examples, let's try and generalize that across the country.
Right. Thank you very much. We've run out of time completely. So a quick sum up, though it will not be the perfect sum up, is that we've got 4 or 5 things that we have to address urgently. I think perhaps the biggest one is fear. And the fear and the communication to people to, in a sense, address that fear. And managing that communication is itself a challenge, as we've seen. So if you can communicate to people and tell them not to feel afraid or worried or apprehensive because this virus is an unknown phenomenon, that itself will be a big step. The second is, not necessarily in that order, is cash. A lot of people need money urgently, and if they're given that money and transferred into their accounts, as others have been saying, that would obviously be an important step. The third is to fix responsibility on employers, whether you're as a homemaker or as an employer of a large company or an organization. You should be ensuring that the people who depend on you, even if it's several layers removed, are protected, particularly in these times. And do not send home people just because they cannot come home and do the job of being domestic help. And finally, there are some structural issues, including how do we make it feasible to compensate landowners, and equally give people land or rights to land to stay and to live in cities, so that they do not resort to flight when in a situation like this. Amongst many other important suggestions and questions that have come on our chat. So thank you all for joining us. We've got 3 more sessions as we pick up on points of no return. Today was about relief and rehabilitation. In coming episodes, we'll look at the issue of the rural economy, and also what industry should be specifically doing to regenerate demand and bring back the migrants, something that we've touched upon already. Thank you all for joining us once again, and have a great day ahead.
Thank you, Govind.
Thank you. Thanks, Govind.
Thank you, Parth. Thank you, NAUSHAD.